Welcome, everybody, to the first fire drill with a new Democratic administration in place. As Greenpeace's Annie Leonard says, I am hopeful, I am relieved, and I am ready. During the campaign, President Joe Biden gave us reasons to be hopeful. Now our job is to make sure that he follows through on his promises, and we're off to a good start with 3 of his executive orders, which will be our good news. And the xylophone doesn't do it. I really need a trumpet, but I don't have one, so I'll just launch in. Number 1, an order signed by Acting Interior Secretary Scott de la Vega on Wednesday bars the department from pushing ahead with any new leasing or drilling permits on public lands and waters for 60 days. It also blocks any new major mining action. Now, as you know, President Biden has nominated New Mexico's representative, Deb Haaland, to lead the Interior Department. So as soon as she's confirmed, she can sign this measure and make the moratorium on new drilling permanent. Number 2, Biden's canceling the Keystone XL pipeline meant to move 830,000 barrels a day of crude tar sands oil from Alberta, Canada, to refineries in the Gulf of Mexico. This brings to a close a decades-long fight by climate activists to halt the project. He's canceled, Biden has, Trump's order to start drilling in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, yay. And then he's brought us back into the Paris Climate Agreement. Oh God, it feels so good. And we need to celebrate these climate victories. We do, how sweet they are. So much activism has gone into this. It's so important, I think, for all of you to really understand this. These great changes aren't just because of good guys in office, okay? Activists made him do it. Years of marches and protests and civil disobedience, arrests. See how these things pay off when there's somebody there who listens to us? Also, while we celebrate, we have to remember the workers and demand that the more than 1,000 of them on the Keystone Project need to be protected, paid, and trained for new union jobs. And the oil can remain in the ground as stranded assets, but the workers must never be stranded assets. Let's ensure that Biden shows his commitment to a just transition that protects the livelihoods of those who, through no fault of their own, may have to pay the price of change. According to the Labor Network for Sustainability report, we can create 5 times more jobs and better jobs in the pipeline and construction industries than the proposed Keystone XL by investing in much needed water, think Flint, Michigan, sewer and gas infrastructure projects in Montana, South Dakota, Nebraska, Oklahoma, and Texas. Those are the 5 states along the proposed pipeline route where jobs are going to be lost. Every dollar spent on gas, water, and sewer infrastructure in those states generates 156% more employment than the Keystone XL pipeline would have generated. And there's so many jobs to be had in retrofitting buildings, building electric vehicle infrastructure, weatherizing homes, and strengthening this country's aging bridges, tunnels, dams, and roads. They need to be strengthened for the extreme climate events that are coming along, And all those green jobs need to be union jobs that can support a family and create a career. Now is the moment to show we care about workers. And speaking of oil, speaking of Keystone, Fire Drill Friday has concentrated a lot over the last months on fossil fuels because we want to make sure that people understand that they are what lie behind the climate crisis. But a lot of people question whether green alternatives can actually become a working reality in time. That's the myth that the fossil fuel industry has promulgated. So today, we're going to explore the viability of the green renewable future. and how we get there. The question is, can this country really be powered by the sun and the wind? You know, according to the International Energy Agency, green electricity is on track to become the largest power source by 2025, displacing coal, which has dominated for the past 50 years. The value of shares in solar companies has more than doubled since December 2019, while fossil fuel shares are struggling, despite the fact that governments have dispersed far more of the COVID recovery funds to the fossil fuel industry than they have to the green energy industry. Our new president has a narrow window when large-scale investments in solar are possible. If he really wants to recover from the pandemic by making the US more resilient to a future public health, economic, and environmental crises, he'll start by enacting his plan for a clean energy revolution, which calls for achieving 100% clean electricity by 2035. This can lead to a much more rapid deployment of solar electricity, known as photovoltaic cells, or PV, and wind turbines. Right now, electricity only makes up about 1/5 of all energy use. The majority of energy emissions is from burning carbon fuels in transportation, industry, and heating. But science dictates we electrify everything and fast, so as not to lock in another generation of fossil fuel infrastructure. Biden can ask his energy secretary to prioritize programs that fund the deployment of new low carbon technologies across all sectors of the economy. Congress must immediately extend solar energy's investment tax credit and wind energy's production tax credit. This would enable these clean industries to hire people fast. Now, you know, we had those in California back in the 1970s, 50 years ago. And my home in Santa Monica was 100% solar, totally off the grid, 50 years ago. And a ranch I had on the top of the hills above Santa Barbara was powered by a wind generator and photovoltaic cells. Then Ronald Reagan came along and canceled all of it. And now, 50 years later, we're starting again. God, the time that's been lost. The country needs a lot of new power transmission and grid modernization, including large investments in grid-scale storage batteries. Biden could ensure this, while at the same time he could set in motion the building of a national electric vehicle charging network. And let's make sure there are charging stations at all post offices. Do you remember? I think a lot of you do. We talked about this during a previous Fire Drill Friday with Mark Diamondstein, president of the American Postal Workers Union, who was eager for this to happen. Doing all this will not only reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but also add 550,000 jobs each year, while saving the US economy $78 billion. It will mean a US as a carbon neutral country with higher economic growth. And yeah, this is going to cost money, but there were $14 billion climate disasters last year. Just alone in 1 year, 14 of them. Over the last 3 years, the total cost of billion-dollar weather and climate events exceeded $450 billion. In Northern California, the publicly traded utility Pacific Gas and Electric, you've heard of it as PG&E, it declared bankruptcy in 2019 when faced with paying for $30 billion in damages from devastating wildfires. There's going to be more of these in the years ahead. These are the costs of inaction, okay? So we must find the money to move away from fossil fuels, and we can. Experts say we can trim hundreds of billions of dollars from our bloated defense budget and still be very safe. And what about the $20 billion in taxpayer subsidies that we've been shelling out to the very industry that's making us sick and killing us? Biden has to end all artificial support for fossil fuels that fund an unsustainable system. These fossil fuel subsidies expose the hypocrisy of the fossil fuel industry and their enablers, who tout free market principles but benefit from corporate capitalism. Here's an example. Wind developers negotiate market-based lease rates with private landowners, while oil and gas companies are given subsidized leases on federal land. And while the biofuel sector has to set prices at a level that recovers all costs from farm to pump, the protection of global oil markets and shipping lanes is paid for out of defense budgets. Coal plants, I bet you didn't know this, are subsidized by Medicaid, who picks up the tab for downwind pollution-induced asthma and sickness and death from premature births. What this all means is that the cheaper and cleaner green technologies aren't competing on a level playing field. Our guest today, Dr. Leah Stokes, knows more than most about how to get to a nation run on green energy. I am so excited that we have her. Dr. Stokes is an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and is affiliated with the Bren School of Environmental Science and Management and the Environmental Studies Department. She works on energy, climate, and environmental politics. Her book, Short Circuiting Policy, examines the role that utilities have played in promoting climate denial. She's also contributed to the anthology, All We Can Save, which is it's just a beautiful book. I highly recommend it. You can see it right over her shoulder on her bookshelf. Welcome to you, Dr. Leah Stokes. I'm so grateful that you can take the time to share your knowledge on Fire Drill Fridays.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, Jane. I'm so grateful for all the work that you have been doing to elevate these issues and using your platform really for such important causes. So thank you for what you do every week to really bring this message home.
Thanks. So my first question is, we hear a lot about the need to transition from fossil fuels to clean renewable energy, but what does that really mean? What is clean renewable energy and what needs to happen to speed up the transition?
Yeah, so right now, a lot of our society is powered by fossil fuels. And as you talked about in your introduction, this is causing climate change. So, what we've been doing is fueling our cars with oil, which is a fossil fuel, our homes with gas, right? Fossil gas is used for cooking and heating. We've been running our electricity system on things like coal and gas. And all of these things lead to carbon pollution, which, of course, is destabilizing our climate. And of course, that's not the only costs of running a fossil fuel-based energy system. We know that we have been putting coal plants overwhelmingly in the backyards of Black Americans for many decades now. And this has led to really large health costs amongst Black Americans. We know, for example, that Black children have asthma rates that are 2 times as high as white children. And that is a direct consequence of our fossil fuel-based energy system. If we didn't have communities that we somehow treated like they weren't equal, that we somehow treated like they were expendable, we would have nowhere to place this fossil fuel infrastructure, because many other people, would rise up and they would say, I don't want this in my backyards. But we have been externalizing these costs by putting them in Black, Latinx, and Indigenous backyards. And that really needs to stop. So what is the alternative? Can we get off fossil fuels? Well, I loved your intro, Jane, when you talked about your own personal experience of doing it 50 years ago, because it's so true. In my own book, I studied the history of clean energy and renewable energy, and a lot of that happened in California. And we have had technologies like wind and solar for decades now. What we haven't had is consistent government support to really help these technologies grow. So in my work, I look at where we are today, which is at 40% clean energy, and where we need to go, which is towards 100% clean electricity by 2035. And we need to dramatically be scaling up the pace every year of how much clean electricity we build in order to get there. And even though we we've seen a lot of booms and busts in government support for renewable energy. As you mentioned, we have had very consistent support for fossil fuels throughout this period. Today, we spend $20 billion annually in federal subsidies for fossil fuels, and that really has to stop. And though that subsidy estimate does not even include, of course, all the health costs, like you were talking about, that are really quite real, and they're being picked up by other parts of our society and even our government. So, the time for decarbonizing our electricity system and using clean electricity to run a big part of our economy is now, and we really do have the technologies that we need.
Investments in solar and wind energy are growing around the world. The cost of solar energy and electrical vehicles are becoming more competitive every day. Can you explain why isn't that enough? Why shouldn't we just leave the transition to clean energy to market forces? Why do we need our government to get involved?
Yeah, so the only reason why EVs and solar are cost competitive is because of government policy. I've written research papers on this. So what happens is, we have a new technology, let's say offshore wind, and right now it's quite expensive. Why is that? Well, we haven't built a lot of offshore wind projects in this country. We're at about one right now in the United States. And so in the early days of any industry, whether that's like computers or semiconductors or solar panels, it's expensive, right? Because you're experimenting, you're learning new things. But then as that industry makes more and more solar panels or wind turbines or electric batteries or electric vehicles, what happens is the cost falls. And so government support, particularly in the early days of an industry, is the reason why we have cheaper technology today. And I'll just point out that doesn't just hold for the clean technologies that we need. It also holds for fracking. The reason why fracking became so cheap was because of government investment in early days in learning about hydraulic fracturing technology. So these technologies don't just kind of fall out of the sky cheap, right? Or they don't fall out of the sky because of markets. It's really government support that is so critical to reducing costs. We're at a moment right now where wind and solar are cost competitive. They can compete, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be brought into the market. Why is that? Well, in my book, Short Circuiting Policy, I study electric utilities. You have an electric utility. This is the company that you pay money to in order to buy your electricity. And a lot of electric utilities in our country are what's called vertically integrated monopolies. This is a lot of jargon, but the basic point is you don't get to choose who you buy your electricity from, and they own the whole system. So that means that if they want to do something like keep a coal plant open because they've put an enormous amount of debt into that coal plant and it's in their financial interest to keep operating that, there's very little that the economic system or that consumers as everyday people can do to put pressure on those utilities to shut those coal plants down. So there's really fantastic research from groups like Energy Innovation that shows that right now there are coal plants, particularly in the southeast part of the United States and the Midwest. These coal plants could be shut down tomorrow, replaced by a wind project, and it would save customers money. So it's actually cheaper to be using wind and solar in a lot of cases, but there isn't market signals in our electricity sector like we might expect there to be, like there might be in other markets. So the government really needs to step up. And at the state level, there has been a lot of progress. In fact, more than 1 in 3 Americans at the state and local level live in a place today that is targeting 100% clean electricity. So what we really need to happen this year is for Congress to step up and finally match all this amazing action at the state and local level and say, you know what, the electricity sector, we need to be on a path to 100% clean power by 2035. And what is so exciting is that that is what we can now say President Joe Biden campaigned and won on. So I think that this has got to be a top item for Congress this year.
Great explanation. Thank you. Many of us would love to power our homes with clean, renewable energy, but we don't have a choice where our energy comes from when we turn on the switch or plug something in. How can we find out where our home's energy comes from and what we can do if our utilities don't provide clean energy?
Yeah, electric utilities are tricky beasts, so to speak. I've done a lot of work studying these companies. I also have a podcast called A Matter of Degrees, where we've done several episodes explaining how electric utilities work. So if you're interested in understanding more, you can check that out. You can also read my book, but that's a little bit more technical, so to speak. So this is a more accessible version of it. The fact is that electric utilities are monopolies in a lot of the country. So sometimes you're going to have an electric utility like I have, Southern California Edison, SCE. That's a private monopoly utility. So they're privately owned or they're traded on the stock market usually, right? So people can invest in them. Other people might have utilities called municipal utilities. This is, for example, in Sacramento. Sacramento has a municipal utility called SMUD. That's often controlled by the city council. Other parts of our country have what's called rural electric cooperatives. These were new utilities that grew out of the New Deal, actually, and they were trying to make sure that power existed in rural parts of our states. And in addition, there's also another category, which is federal power authorities, like the Tennessee Valley Authority, right? So it's a very complicated system, but the point is, you can figure out who your electricity provider is, and you can Google and look up what is their electricity mix. And what you'll find in a lot of states is that it's not as clean as you would like it to be. Now, in some places, you can choose to buy your electricity and pay a little bit extra to get it all from wind and all from solar. That happens in a bunch of different ways, but you can try looking that up in your area to see if that's possible. But more than just putting money towards, clean power, which I think is important, what's even more important is putting pressure on these utilities to be doing the right thing. So we need our utilities to be supporting clean electricity standards and to be on a path for 100% clean by 2035. And you might say, well, that'll be hard for them. They have coal plants, they have gas plants. What are they going to do? Well, the government can help them retire those plants. There are lots of tools being used in places like Colorado, Michigan, and New Mexico to basically retire the debt of coal plants fast and get those coal plants turned off. And in the process, as Jane was talking about, also help workers, make sure the communities and workers are also made whole and supported as part of the transition. This, for those interested in the wonky details, is called coal plant securitization. And the Rocky Mountain Institute has been doing a lot of work on it. So you can just Google that weird word and you can learn about that. So there are policies that can help retire this coal debt quickly and move us towards clean power. And why should utilities do this? Well, utilities, in my view, need to wake up and recognize that if they get on the clean power bandwagon, they can not only run the power system at the size that it is now. Guess what? They're also going to be fueling our cars through electric vehicles. They're going to be fueling our homes through our induction stoves and our electric heat pumps. They're going to be running huge parts of our society. And so actually they have a lot to gain in the clean energy transition. And we really need utilities to start waking up, because if we're going to take on the oil industry and the fossil fuel industry, eventually utilities might be really good allies in that effort. Currently, they're not allies, but we're hopefully close to starting to get them on the page that clean energy is the future and it's in their own financial interest.
Wow, a whole new sector that we have to win over. Really thought about that. So, Dr. Leah, let's talk about subsidies for the fossil fuel industry. Explain to the audience what subsidies are and what kind of subsidies do US taxpayers already give fossil fuel companies, and how much do they matter?
Yeah, so fossil fuel subsidies are a way that our federal government makes it cheaper to continue to extract fossil fuels, particularly oil and gas. And they come in a lot of different ways, and we can think about them in different ways. So when we talk about the $20 billion number, which is commonly used, those are direct subsidies, which basically means they're giveaways to the fossil fuel companies from the federal government. So fossil fuel companies get to pay lower taxes than they should have been paying, to the tune of $20 billion a year every single year. And that happens through rules in our tax code, like if they're drilling a well and they find some oil, as they start to depreciate that as they start to draw down that well, they get to pay like lower and lower taxes. So as that resource goes away, their tax rate also falls, right? There's lots of little things like that, but there's important other kinds of subsidies, like, for example, support for research and development to create the entire industry of hydraulic fracturing, right? If the federal government hadn't provided funding to that industry, it would have never gotten started. And it's important to note that when it comes to fracking, and Amy Westervelt, a journalist, has done really excellent work on this. When it comes to fracking, these companies mostly don't make money, and they have never made money. This is actually a very bad financial investment to go into fracking. I don't think anybody on the call was planning on it, but I wouldn't recommend it, And so there's been a lot of support from the federal government to learn how to do oil and gas extraction more effectively in new areas. And that is a big subsidy too. And of course, what many think the biggest subsidy of all is the fact that we don't make them pay for their true costs, that they get to pollute our atmosphere, destabilize our climate, poison people in this country, particularly Black, Latinx, and Indigenous people, and never have to pick up the costs of those harms that they are not just causing to hypothetical future generations, but to people in the here and now. So if you're interested in this, actually, an organization called Evergreen Action, which is the former Inslee campaign staffers, they're putting out a paper maybe as soon as next week, which is going to talk about all of the different fossil fuel subsidies that happen from the federal government. And it's got to be on our agenda this year to finally end these federal government handouts, because the fossil fuel industry has had subsidies year in and year out for like a century, okay? The renewable energy industry gets a little bit of support every once in a while in a very boom and bust fashion. So we can't keep having this uneven playing field. We really have to remove these subsidies. And I hope that will be on the agenda this year.
Great. Can you talk about the ways that the fossil fuel industry has worked to undermine and attack climate policies?
Absolutely. So that was the focus of my book, Short Circuiting Policy. And it looked at how fossil fuel companies, but also electric utilities, have been resisting the clean energy transition. Some of you may be familiar with the work of Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway. These are historians who wrote a book called Merchants of Doubt. And it's great because that book was actually turned into a documentary. So if you don't want to read a book, you can watch a movie. It's actually quite a depressing film, I would say, not in a bad way, but it really hits you, the lying that has gone on from the fossil fuel industry and the consequences of those lies for our present situation. And, we've seen just in the last few weeks what lying does to our democracy and our world, right? All these lies about what happened in the election led to the horrible riot and insurrection at the Capitol. And, we need to link that kind of lying to the lying that the fossil fuel industry and electric utilities have been doing, spreading climate denial, from the 1980s onwards. And there's been really great work by Naomi Oreskes and Jeffrey Supran on that. So my book tries to flesh that out and show that it's not just fossil fuel companies who've been lying about climate change and delaying action. It's also electric utilities. You don't even have to go that far back in time. If you go just to 2017, the CEO of Southern Company, a major utility that operates throughout the Southeast in places like Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi, their CEO went on television and questioned the science of climate change in 2017. And that person is still the CEO of that company. So, utilities have been lockstep alongside fossil fuel companies for too long. And what have they been doing to try to delay action other than spreading climate denial? Well, they have been working both directly with our elected representatives at the state and federal level to try to roll back policies that build the clean energy future. And they've been working indirectly, particularly through the public, to make it seem like the public doesn't want clean energy when that's not true. So what do I mean by that? There's something called astroturfing. This is like fake grassroots. All of us here today on this call, we're real grassroots, right? Like we really believe in this. We spend our free time doing this. Jane gives so much of her time to this. Well, this is a real grassroots effort. Well, the power of these movements, like the climate movement, They're very powerful. And you can see how powerful they are because the electric utilities and fossil fuel companies have started to try to imitate them. They've started to try to make a facsimile of our movement. And that is what astroturfing is. It's fake grassroots. And so what they do is they run front campaigns that they pretend like the public's all upset about something. They show up to meetings, they send out flyers, and they're pretending to represent grassroots when they're not really. This is actually playing out right in my backyard in California right now. There's an organization called Californians for Balanced Energy Solutions. It was funded and established by a gas company in Southern California called SoCal Gas. This is my gas supplier, and if you live in LA or in the area, they're your gas supplier too. Just as a side note, SoCal Gas was also responsible for a massive leak of fossil gas at a storage facility at Porter Ranch a few years ago. That leak was bigger than the Deepwater Horizon spill in terms of carbon emissions. It went on for months. So this is not a responsible company. So what have they done? They've decided to make a fake group called Californians for Balanced Energy Solutions and to pretend like the public doesn't want to electrify buildings, because groups like Sierra Club have been out there trying to get these buildings electrified across California. I'll tell you, in Santa Barbara, where I live, I woke up on like right before New Year's and my friend texted me and she'd gotten a message out of nowhere on her phone saying, people don't want this gas ban. Write to the city council. It's going to destabilize our grid. Californians for Balanced Energy Solutions. So they actually texted perhaps 20% of Santa Barbara, spreading false information and generating all these letters to the city council right before they had an important meeting to make the right climate decision. Now, thankfully, our city council did make the right decision on a unanimous basis, but I gotta say, it was way more controversial than it needed to be because the gas company was out there spreading misinformation and confusing the public. So these are the sort of tactics that we all have to be aware of, because the more progress we make as a movement, the more we're going to see these kinds of attacks from the fossil fuel industry.
Changing our energy policy isn't something individuals can do alone, right? So would you talk about flight shaming and things like that, and why the fossil fuel industry has made us feel that the climate crisis is our fault because of the choices we make?
Yeah, that was quite a good tactic, wasn't it? Right? Why would it be their fault if it was all of our fault? We all live in a carbon intensive society. So what we really need to do is purify ourselves. Well, it's important to remember that the idea of a carbon footprint, right? That you should go online and get a calculator and figure out what your carbon footprint was, that was actually popularized by a fossil fuel company, British Petroleum or BP. And what the goal has been is to make us turn inwards and to really divide ourselves. Michael Mann actually has been talking about this too, that, if we have purity tests, it's a way of dividing our movement. Because if we say, oh, well, you're not vegan, or you don't have 100%, you don't have solar panels on your roof, or you don't have an electric vehicle, you're not pure enough. That's a way of cutting people out. And it's important to note that some of those decisions, like putting solar on your roof or buying an electric vehicle, obviously those are great decisions if you can make them. And I've made them personally. I'm sure Jane has too, as she's talked about, and we encourage you to do that. But keep in mind that not everybody has equal financial resources in our society, and that we have massive income inequality, particularly on racial lines, and that the tax credits and federal support that we've had for people to adopt solar, to adopt electric vehicles, have overwhelmingly been used by white people who can more easily access those incentives. So we have to recognize that the choices about decarbonizing our footprint are baked into our society. They aren't really individual choices. If you want to take a train, let's say, from a city to another city, there has to be a train system available for you to even take in the first place, right? And what has happened is our train infrastructure has been gutted in this country. So it's great that flight shaming has taken off in Europe, and Greta Thunberg has been out there really changing people's approach to the climate crisis. And obviously, we're all so inspired by her work. It's been transformational. But people in Europe can choose to take the train rather than the plane because they have train infrastructure. Those choices are not even available to a lot of people in the United States. So we have to remember that the climate problem is a structural problem, and we have to attack its structural roots. And that is why activism around government policy is the most important thing you can do. Because if we can get one of those government policies to change, like if we could get a 100% clean electricity standard by 2035, that would transform all our lives, right? That would mean we wouldn't have to worry about where our electricity is coming from and is it clean or not, because everybody in this country would have access to clean electricity as a given. So I think that all of us should do what we can in our daily lives. I'm a huge gardener. I love composting. I drive an electric vehicle. I don't eat a lot of meat. These are choices that I've made. And I'm sure everybody here is really committed and making their own personal choices. But we should recognize that the fossil fuel industry's fixation on individual action is a distraction from the really big changes that we have to make, which are structural changes to really stop extracting fossil fuels.
What about carbon offsets? I mean, if you fly, you buy carbon offsets and feel good about it. What about that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And actually, on this podcast, A Matter of Degrees, we did an episode of that. It's called, the episode is called Cleaning Up Our Carbon Mess. Can we clean up our carbon mess? Offsets are a really good idea in theory, right? All of us want to do the right thing. And if we can figure out a place that we can cut carbon, even while maybe we still need to fly for work, that's a great idea. That's a really great motivation to have. But in practice, offsets haven't worked as well as we would hope. There are some offsets that I think have been pretty great, which have been, for example, helping cook stoves in the developing world, get people to have access to better cooking facilities. And that not only has a climate impact, also has a really great public health impact, because a lot of people are still, burning biomass, meaning like wood or even animal waste inside their homes. And that's really bad for their own lungs and health. So, early stage carbon offsets were a lot about cook stove projects in the developing world. And I think that that was a better approach. But a lot of offsets have been about, forestry and trying to protect forests or plant new forests. And they have ended up creating a lot of perverse incentives and probably haven't delivered the carbon savings that we really need. If people are interested in learning more about that, they could look at ProPublica reporter Lisa Song's work on this. And, I think more than just the challenges in offsets, we have to make sure that we don't pass laws and policies that allow us to not change what we're doing here in the United States because of some idea that somewhere else in the world, good things will be happening. We really have to make sure that emissions cuts here are real, and we can't continue to bank on hypothetical offsets elsewhere. So that really is the conversation around offsets. And it doesn't mean, again, that we shouldn't try to find ways to support developing countries in their transition, even on a personal basis. We should do those things. But we have to be realistic that the real way to cut emissions is to cut them in the United States, in the electricity sector, in the transportation sector, in the building sector, and in industrial sector. We've got to make real structural changes. And we can't keep procrastinating by assuming that somebody else is going to solve our climate problem for us.
Driving a car is a very individual thing to do. And I was really kind of astonished when I read, you said in one of your books that with the pandemic, when, people weren't flying and still aren't very much, or driving, or, a lot of people aren't even leaving their home, but the emissions barely budged. I mean, it fell 8%.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. That's right.
You wrote that we need emissions to fall that much every year in order to keep warming at 1.5 degrees Celsius. But how do we do that?
Yeah. So, the focus on individual action, we've actually had a kind of test, an experiment in the real world this year, right? Which is that all of us as individuals shrunk our carbon footprints in a lot of ways. We didn't fly places, we didn't drive places. And there have been some nice side effects to that, even though obviously the pandemic has been terrible. And I just want to underline the fact that this is not the vision for decarbonizing our economy, right? When we talk about climate action, it's not about sacrifice and sitting in your home. So don't take the metaphor too far, because this was a very weird way of cutting emissions. But What we learned is, let's take Los Angeles, right? Los Angeles is a place that has a lot of traffic and therefore has pretty bad air quality. In fact, one of the reasons why California can set its own rules around how polluting cars can be is because LA has had such bad air quality for decades, right? Now, what happened at the beginning of the pandemic is people weren't going anywhere. And so suddenly the views in Los Angeles were so much clearer. Maybe you experienced this, Jane, but you could see the Channel Islands or you could see the mountains. There was all of a sudden this sense that, wow, we can have clean air. And what I want people to understand is that we can have clean air every single day and we don't have to stay in our homes. How can we do that? We can use electric vehicles. Electric vehicles don't put out pollution out their tailpipes, right? And so people don't have to live a different lifestyle in order to have a clean air and clean water and a stable climate. So as you said, Jane, we did manage to cut emissions this year, but those were not long-lasting emissions because they were about sort of individual behavior changes. They weren't structural changes to our economy. We need to get those structural changes done, like changing the way we make electricity, getting rid of coal plants, getting rid of gas plants. We need to change the way we drive around, getting rid of cars that are combustion engine cars and moving towards electric vehicles. In our homes, and I want to encourage everybody on this call to think about this, we are burning fossil fuels in our homes, right? When you cook on a gas stove, when you have a gas hot water heater or a gas furnace, that is a fossil fuel. I have that in my home right now. And when my New Year's resolution is to get rid of it in my home. So I bought an induction stove, which is considered by chefs actually to be even better to cook on than a gas stove. So it's not sacrifice, it's actually benefit. And I'm going to get an electric heat pump as well, which will do both heating and cooling, which because climate change is getting so much worse in Southern California, more and more people are going to need air conditioning too. So, there are structural changes that we can make. And even though I'm making that individual choice, what I really want to see is our federal government pass policies that would give money to everyday people who might not be able to afford to change their stove or to change their electric hot water heater or to a heat pump, because these things can be really expensive to people. So if we want to be hitting these 7 to 8% emissions reduction targets every single year, that's the kind of thing we need. We need 100% clean electricity standard to be passed through Congress. We need support for people to be buying electric vehicles and getting electric stoves, induction stoves, getting heat pumps. These things have to come with financial support. There's a lot that we can do. And believe it or not, if we clean up our electricity system and we electrify transportation, the parts that we can, we electrify our building sector, and we electrify about half of heavy industry, which is possible, guess how much of our emissions that gets us? 70 to 80%. Okay, so this is a vision for really deep decarbonization. And of course, there will be challenges as we get to further and further decarbonization, but there is so much that we can do with the technology that we have today. And I'll say one nice thing. In the House of Representatives federally, they made a decision actually that the rules that they use for procedure, which is like you have to make sure you can pay for things before these bills pass. It makes it very difficult to do things. They decided that they weren't going to do that for climate anymore, because here's the thing: when we pass climate bills, they pay themselves back. They employ people, they clean up our air, and therefore, reduce health costs for us. They put us on a pathway to a clean energy future, which means we're going to have technologies that we can sell around the world and share with countries around the world. Every dollar that we put into the clean energy future is a dollar that will come back to us like tenfold. So I really am excited that we finally have an opportunity this year to make the structural changes through Congress that are necessary to really get those emissions to be cutting every single year.
One of the things that isn't really talked about or thought about enough, I think, is the fact that fossil fuel energy is undemocratic, and obtaining it has led us into war over the last 40 years. All of the wars that we fought have been about oil. One of the beauties of solar and wind energy is that it can be locally owned and controlled. Energy democracy is what it represents. And unlike fossil fuels, renewable energy is everywhere, so there's no need for costly wars and invasions. But how can we make sure that local ownership of green energy happens in those places where it's feasible?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And it really is something that we need to think about. The clean energy transition must have inequality at its center, right? We have such an inequality crisis in this country, and we have to be thinking about how we're going to solve that. And as I mentioned, that inequality is very much on racial lines, it's very much on gender lines. And so it really replicates a lot of the injustices in our society. So we don't want to just build the clean energy future and continue to have that massive unequal society. So clean energy is a potential way that we can help to address some of this inequality. Of course, building it in and of itself and cleaning up the air will be particularly valuable for Black, Latinx, and Indigenous communities because we have been putting the dirty fossil fuels in their backyards. I have a project where I look at protests against wind energy because some people do protest against wind projects. And one thing I point out in that is that if we don't build clean energy at the pace that's necessary, there are real consequences in terms of keeping coal plants open and keeping gas plants open and really poisoning communities of color. So these choices in terms of the pace that we move and where we put stuff by their nature have inequality implications. In terms of how we can design the system to be more equal, a lot of people have been thinking about that. I want to give a shout out to Shalonda Baker's new book called Revolutionary Power. It just came out this week. And she was also named this week to the Department of Energy to be working on environmental justice. This is the first time, as I understand it, that the Department of Energy is centering environmental justice. And they could not have a better person than Shalonda Baker because she's a lawyer who's been thinking about these issues for a long time. And her book just came out and it's really great. So I'd recommend people check that out. And she's asking the exact question that Jane just asked me, which is, how do we make sure that there's equality in the clean energy transition? And we can think about that in a number of ways. There is proposals and policies in place in some places like Minnesota for community solar, which allows people to own a part of a solar project, even if they don't own a house and don't have the ability to stick solar on their roof, or maybe they have like a shady roof so they can't put solar there. So that is a way that more people can be participating. Another thing that we can be thinking about is designing our policies like these tax credits that exist to help people put solar on their roof. We need to make sure that that is more accessible to more people, because actually some of my colleagues have been doing research on solar adoption. And the good news is that it's actually quite bipartisan. We've got Republicans adopting solar and Democrats adopting solar, but it's very white. It's largely wealthier white people who are adopting these technologies. And why is that? Because they have capital and they have tax liability. And so they can afford to do it under the way we design the policy. So we have to be thinking about policies that have equity in mind and that allow more people to participate in the clean energy transition. Because otherwise, this transition could be a way to really be reinforcing inequality. And that is not a goal that I think that we should have.
Beautifully said. Thank you. How can we make certain that when the new administration begins planning for a green energy future, that that leaders from rural and indigenous communities and communities of color are part of the planning process, part of drafting the plan? How do we ensure that?
That is a great question. And it's long been an ask of the environmental justice community that they are part of the decision-making process, not simply rubber stampers at the end of the day or, used as kind of props when we pass policies. So I think that's really important. And at least from my experience looking at the Joe Biden campaign, looking at the staffing decisions that are being made by the administration right now, I actually have pretty deep hope that that will be their approach. Joe Biden ran, and alongside Kamala Harris, they ran and won on the most ambitious climate platform in American history for any candidate for president. And it had at its center justice. One of the three signature pledges. There was three. The first was the 100% clean electricity standard that I've been talking about by 2035. The second one was $2 trillion in investments over this first term, which, remember, the federal budget is typically around $4 trillion a year. So that's a very big number, 2 trillion. And 40% of investments going to disadvantaged and frontline communities. And we can understand that 40% number as coming from environmental justice advocates, because actually in places like New York and California, environmental justice groups have long been campaigning that some of these resources actually have to flow into communities of color and into disadvantaged communities, and also into communities that have been historically extracting fossil fuels and have lots of employment in that area that, are struggling as we transition. And so that number and that key part of that plan comes from environmental justice movements. And I think the fact that we see that in a presidential platform is just so hopeful in terms of their ability to listen to and work alongside environmental justice leaders. And it's not just cheap talk. My understanding is that when Joe Biden was running for president, he actually met with environmental justice leaders himself to get their input. And that when the protests were happening as part of the movement for Black Lives last summer, he really saw the intersections between, racial justice and climate justice and wanted to incorporate that into his plan. And seeing somebody like Shalonda Baker be appointed in the first week of the administration to the Department of Energy, I think really just underlines how much justice is at the center of how they'll be thinking. Now, we got to make sure Congress is alongside the Biden-Harris administration, right? They got to be on the same tune. They got to be singing from the same choir book, so to speak.
Yeah. Well, that's up to us.
Sorry?
That's up to us.
That's up to us. Exactly, Jane. We got work to do, don't we?
Yeah. Leah, that you're so great. All how you know everything and can express it so well. We have about 5 minutes for audience questions, Maddie.
Oopsie.
I'm so fascinated. I asked a lot of questions. Let's have a few audience questions.
Sure. Leah, from Danny on Zoom, how did you get into this field where you are now?
Sure. Great question. So I've been working on climate change for 15 years, and I started as an undergraduate at the University of Toronto. I was really worried about the climate crisis, and I was a psychology student at that time. And what I started by doing was running individual behavior change programs, literally, where I tried to get people to turn off the lights and turn off their computers and take the stairs rather than the elevator, things like that. And at the end of that experience, we actually saved a lot of energy. We saved about 10%, which for a behavior change program is quite good. But I just walked away from that thinking, this is not a big enough lever. I need to get to the government. I got to get policy in order to get the changes fast enough. I can't just work with individuals. And so I decided to study a master's of public administration at Columbia, which is, a degree that helps you learn about how government works. And then I did a master's in political science and a PhD in public policy. So I really moved in the direction of policy and government and politics because I believed that was the biggest barrier and the biggest opportunity when it comes to climate action.
Thank you. From Zachary on Zoom. Dr. Stokes, you mentioned that electric utilities want to keep coal and gas plants open because of debt that they've invested in them. Could government bail out that debt to let utilities choose how to move forward without being tied down by these past debts?
Absolutely. What a great question and a great idea. This person's ready to be a policymaker. And that's exactly what some governments are doing. So, and actually on our podcast, A Matter of Degrees, we're planning on doing an episode about this probably next season. So stay tuned. But in Michigan, this is happening, in New Mexico, and in Colorado. And as I mentioned, the term, if you want to learn more about this, is called securitization, and the Rocky Mountain Institute has been doing a lot on it. But there are ways that we can say, look, you made these bad decisions, you invested in this coal. That was a bad decision, and probably ethically we shouldn't bail you out. But you know what? We have this climate crisis and public health crisis, and we got to get rid of these things. So let's just come together. Let's write off that debt. Let's shut down those plants. Let's make sure the communities and the workers are taken care of as part of this process. And we're also going to get lower electricity bills too. So it's a triple win here. And as a thank you for us taking away your debt, you're going to go build a lot of new clean stuff. So there's ideas to do this, not just at the state level, but even federally. This is something that we could do, for example, with the Tennessee Valley Authority, which has a lot of coal plant debt and has limits actually on how much money that they can spend. So they're struggling to get rid of that debt so that they can go and finance new clean energy projects. So this is a solvable problem, and it's not even that expensive. Honestly, it could be like maybe 20 billion, maybe some more, but this is not a huge slice of the pie, right? So we got to get utilities to the table and agree to be shutting down their coal plants, and we can help them do that because it can be a win for electricity consumers, a win for the community if we get the resources flowing in the right direction, and a win for the utility as well.
Thanks, Leah. From Trey on Twitter, Elon Musk is offering $100 million for the best idea for carbon capture. What do you think about this?
Elon, man, always in the news, that guy. I think that there is a view shared between Bill Gates, who's got a new book coming out that I've read and I'm writing a review of, as well as Elon Musk. These people, they're technologists, they're innovators. They think that technology is the answer. And, technology is an important part of the answer, but it's not the whole part of the answer, right? What we really need is government policy to clean up our electricity system as fast as possible and to get as many electric vehicles that Elon Musk is making built as fast as possible. I think where Elon Musk is right is that we don't have safe levels of carbon in the atmosphere right now. We are pushing up at about 415 parts per million, and that is not safe. It's not safe for Southern California. It's not safe for Northern California. It's not safe for Australia or Siberia. Look at these fires in the past year. I mean, it's been terrible. And so one idea is that we can pull carbon out of the air and put it back underground. And that would help to lower atmospheric concentrations of carbon and get the climate back to a safer place. And it's important to do that. And it's great that Elon Musk wants to help, with that. But there's already a lot of money in that, first of all. So I don't know if his prize is going to be the marginal thing. But more to the point, in no way, shape, or form does carbon dioxide removal give any green light for continuing fossil fuel extraction. We have to draw down existing carbon from the fossil fuels we've already burned. We cannot use carbon dioxide removal as a get out of jail free card when it comes to stopping burning fossil fuels. So it's a complex issue. It's great if people want to pitch in and do what they can, but the most number one thing we got to do is activism to get government policies passed to stop burning fossil fuels.
And with that, I just love you, Dr. Leah. Thank you so much. We don't have any more time today, but I'm really grateful to you for your wealth of knowledge and your wonderful positive spirit. Thanks for sharing it with the Fire Drill Friday family.
Well, thank you, Jane. We are all so grateful to you about how you've used your gifts and skills to communicate and share information. I'm sure everybody feels that there's no better climate communicator than you. Whenever I see you on news talking about climate change, I think, gosh, we need more Jane Fondas in the world because she does a better job than the scientists in terms of explaining the stakes.
Thank you very much. It's what I like so much about today's Fire Drill Friday is that I think knowing the solutions, knowing that they will work and they are available to us and that we can get there, that's such a powerful motivator, and it's a real inspiration to keep us working towards that. It's good to be positive. And to all you listeners, now is the time to really push. We can hold the need to unify and heal our nation alongside the urgent need for President Biden to take the necessary actions to end fossil fuels. We can support his steps toward progress while we hold firm in our resolve of what we and all the scientists know must be done. Together, we can leverage this unique moment to make the massive course correction so desperately overdue. Biden has promised to end US fossil fuel subsidies worth billions of dollars a year. Let's make sure he follows through, okay? Fossil fuel subsidies contribute to climate change by depressing the price of fossil fuels, encouraging the greater production and consumption, and therefore emissions, right? These corrupt subsidies are holding us back from building the sustainable energy system we need, and they're keeping the fossil fuel industry alive. Next, revoking federal permits for the Keystone XL pipeline is an important but incomplete start. Biden must go further and do everything in his power to stop other climate wrecking power lines like Line 3. Remember when we had Winona LaDuke as our guest? A lot of people are up there in Minnesota fighting this terrible Line 3. All these workers coming in, and by the way, bringing COVID with them. And we also have to stop the Dakota Access Pipeline, the one that we were all fighting against in Standing Rock in 2017, 16 and 17. Now is the time to begin a just transition, to make investments to ensure that every worker impacted by the decline of the fossil fuel industry is guaranteed the right to thrive in the renewable energy economy. So today we're asking all of you to use the power of social media and send a tweet to President Biden, calling on him to choose people over polluters and stop giving away billions to fossil fuel CEOs. Tell him you want him to take executive action to stop subsidizing and greenlighting coal, oil, and gas extraction, and invest in good paying jobs, a stable climate, and the well-being of our communities. And to do that, please, all of you, visit firedrillfridays.com/takeaction. firedrillfridays.com/takeaction right now to find sample tweets and all the details. Should I talk anymore? I think maybe we'll close up, but I just want to quote something from, at the inauguration. I don't know if all of you were as blown away as I was by that young poet laureate, an LA gal, Amanda Gorman. She spoke the words of our hearts, right, in her amazing poem. She said, quote, "The new dawn blooms as we free it, for there is always light, if only we're brave enough to see it, if only we're brave enough to be it." We are brave enough, aren't we? I mean, we have to be. I love you all. See you next time.